Tonight's presentation is our Florence Bartleman lecture in honour of our first paid librarian at PMI, and it's also Women's History Month. In the hallway on the other side of this wall is a picture of Florence and her sisters. Feel free to read the information we have about her there. And now to our speaker tonight, Sita Sargent, who is the founder and CEO of She Shapes History, one of Australia's fastest growing enterprises. And Sita's book is dead centre in the book display at the back. Delightfully produced book, Sita, if I may say so. She was the 2026 Young Australian of the Year for ACT through walking tours, digital content, and partnerships with cultural institutions and historic sites. She reveals how women's contribution have long been ignored by mainstream history. Sita has also published a book spotlighting the stories of more than 250 women who have shaped history in 31 towns and cities across Australia. I had a look at the Adelaide, and it's very shameful that there are so few women that are available to be in that book. I remember Nurse Thomas from Royal Adelaide, I think it's Thomas from Royal Adelaide Hospital, was quite famous, first Aboriginal woman to be a public servant in South Australia. Sita looks at why women's stories have been pushed to the sidelines and what happens when we bring them back in. We expect to learn some very practical tips on how we can make that shift happen too. So I'll hand over to you, Sita. Sita will be talking for about half an hour and then open for discussion and questions after that.
Awesome, thank you. Do you know how to make it? Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Okay, there we go. Fabulous. Hi everyone, thank you for having me today. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about a bit about my journey, and I'm going to share a few stories of incredible women who have shaped history. But first, I also wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm going to be speaking today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I always like to say it's such an immense and a great privilege to be able to share women's stories and talk about the art of oral storytelling on a land where oral storytelling has been the primary form of sharing art and history and literature and culture for tens of thousands of years. So I really wanted to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and I would like to extend that respect to any First Nations people who are joining us today. So, my name is Sita, and I am not someone who ever thought that I would end up in the space of Australian history or tourism. And I would say that I will forever be a tour guide first and foremost, even though my official title is now CEO, and I lead a team of 5 full-time staff and 32 casual guides, which blows my mind a little bit, but that was all kind of born out of me just being really fed up and frustrated at the lack of respect and recognition for women's historical contributions in my hometown of Canberra. So it's been a really wild 5 years. So I started She Shapes History mid-2021. It was a COVID baby, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how it was started in a moment. But today, it looks like us having 750 guests on tours every single month with the goal of getting that to 1,500 a month by October. It looks like a team of 32 casual guides, all of which are paid, which I'm really proud of. We're in 4 locations. We're in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra and Wollongong, and we have 5 full-time staff. And I don't like giving speeches. I'm not one of those people that kind of thrives in these sorts of situations. I love running tours. I love being a tour guide and the intimacy that that brings, and the fact that it is an active conversation with people. And so I'm going to bring some of that energy today by forcing you all to do a bit of an icebreaker. Not as a group, but I would love if you could turn to the person next to you and just share for like a minute the name of a woman who has shaped your life. You can find someone if you don't have anyone next to you, so you might have to Okay, so we're going to come back. I know, I feel like once you let a group go, start talking, they're not going to stop. Okay, we just coming back, everyone. Amazing. Awesome. Would anyone like to share the person that they chose?
Sure.
Jade.
I chatted with Mary here, and I actually said a woman who has shaped my life, Ellen, our collections librarian. We bumped into each other probably about 7 years
So it
ago.
was more than that, because in all the sites, so it was like
True.
2018.
Yes, okay, in 2018. And ever since then, we have sort of, again, bumped into each other and supported each other's careers and ideas. And, hey, have you seen this? And, I saw this the other day. I know you're interested in that. And now we work together.
That's beautiful. Does anyone else want to share?
There's a woman I met at the Flinders University when I was studying there, that she was a master's student doing a thesis on Aboriginal burial rites, and it was called Substance and Shadow, which I donated to this library. It was a thesis about that thing, absolutely fascinating, and I ended up living in a house as one of those rebel students who couldn't live at home. And I just learned so much from her about life and living.
Oh, that's fabulous. Okay, I'll take one more if anyone else wants to share.
I've got one. Shaping my life now. It's my great aunt. Finding her story, and she was an example of a woman whose story has not been told. It's been told from a matriarchal point of view because of the men that she worked with, but her story has been hidden. So that's my challenge at the moment. So I never knew her because she died before I was born, but fortunately for me, she left her papers in lots of libraries.
Oh, that's great. What an exciting journey to be on. I love this question. And I wanted to then follow it up with, was it hard to think of someone? Did anyone really struggle to think of a woman that shaped their life?
Yes.
Oh gosh, okay.
Can I just say something?
Please, yeah.
It was a man. It was a history teacher when I was in just about, maybe I was 14 or something. He said that the girls are not going to be good this year. The girls are going to be terrible. Only the boys will get through this year and I got really annoyed about it. It was about the Second World War and the First World War, and I decided to study because I was angry at what he'd said.
Oh my
I got packaging revenge, yeah. So he's really wanted to be interested. So that's a reversal of
Yeah, exactly. She's studying on a vengeance. So I have this theory, and I ask this question a lot, and usually it's not hard. People aren't usually going straight to their moment of vengeance that made them study history. But I think it is not hard to think of women who have shaped us as individuals. And I really have this theory, I've tested it, but if you went to the grisliest pub in the grisliest town in Australia, and you went up to the grisliest looking man at the bar, and you said, name 3 women who have shaped your life, he would be able to. It might be his mum, his teacher, and maybe his wife, but he'd be able to give you 3 women. I think that as individuals in this country, we do know in our bones that women shape us and they shape history. I think that where we really, really fall down is at that local level, the city level, and at the state level, and the national level. In Victoria, only 10% of all places are named after women. That is really clearly saying that, like, publicly, that women haven't done anything worth recognising, which is just not true. And I think that, you know, with that question and that recognition that as individuals we recognise that women have shaped history, you're kind of working from a great place. So we're working from that place of, I think, like, optimism. So She Shapes History kind of started with that question and that idea of where are the women in the story of Australia? If we know that women shape our lives, surely they will be there in the story of Australia. And I'm a really big believer in good inquiry questions. My background was in research, and I think in another life I probably would have been a teacher. And I think that this is a great inquiry question. And it's been the question that I've been sitting with for the last 5 years of where are the women in the story of Australia? But what got me asking this question? We're going to go back to 2021. So after years of working towards a career in foreign policy, I did a degree at the University of Queensland in Studies in Religion and English Literature. My honours year was in Studies in Religion with a focus on South Asia. I learnt Sanskrit, which has never come up in my day-to-day life. I ended up, all of my plans to move overseas got kind of, you know, like thrown in the bin, like a lot of people's, and I ended up back in Canberra, the city that I'd grown up in, at my parents' place. And I'd always said that if I end up back in Canberra, it is because all of my dreams died, which is very dramatic. And it was kind of true at the time. So I ended up kind of cold emailing a bunch of academics at the Australian National University, and 2 got back to me, and neither of which was in the area that I'd studied. So I ended up working in a domestic policy research space, which I never thought that I would end up in. And it was the first time in my life that I started, you know, like really deeply engaging with Australian history. And I had this moment where I just went, oh my gosh, this is so much more interesting than anyone ever told me, which I think is a moment that people who start really deeply engaging with Australian history often have, and where they also go like, wow, this explains so much of who we are as a nation. And so I started kind of really diving deep into Australian history. You know, I just finished my honours year, I had a lot of time on my hands, I was only working 30 hours a week, I was trapped at home, and I kept kind of finding myself asking that question of where are the women? And I kept finding them. And I think that if you kind of go in asking that question and you're really intentional about going, I know that they're there, where are they? You will find them. But one of the stories that really made me kind of like so angry and I think put my life on a different path was the story of Marion Marnie Griffin. Is this a woman that many people have heard of? Just a show of hands if you've heard her name before. Yeah, a handful of people. So, Marion Marnie Griffin, as she was the woman who co-designed Canberra. So Canberra, by the way, is the only capital city in the world that has a woman behind it. That is really remarkable that Australia gets to claim that. And the ACT government is currently putting forward a UNESCO bid for Canberra to be recognised as a World City of Design. And part of it is because it is the only known capital in the world that has been designed in large part by a woman. So Marion was this huge architectural powerhouse. You know, she's an American, born and raised in Chicago. She ends up becoming one of the very first women in America to study architecture at university. She becomes the first woman in the world to be registered as an architect. She becomes Frank Lloyd Wright, an architect that I'm sure a lot of us recognize. She becomes his very first staff member and his second in command. And whenever he goes off traveling around Europe, which was often, Marion is the one who ends up stepping in and kind of like managing the office. And it's while she's, working for Frank that she ends up meeting the man who would become her husband and her co-designer, Walter Belly Griffin. So she started as his boss. And the two of them have a quite hilarious love story because they end up bonding on these spite-filled kayaking trips over complaining about their boss, Frank. Which I feel is very relatable for anyone who's been in a workplace with a dodgy boss. And Marion talks about how they, it was a slow burn at first, but when they fell for each other, they really fell. And they end up working together on so many projects. And one of the big things that Walter had been talking about was the fact that this newly federated Australian nation was going to need a capital city. And he was like, I think I'm going to design it. But when the competition, and the Australian government ends up running a competition to kind of design Canberra, and that competition, the news of the competition doesn't reach them though, because they're on their honeymoon until about 2 weeks before the deadline. So they're then having to madly produce this entry to design a capital city. And Marion ends up being the one who does all of the research into the natural landscape. Neither of them have ever been to Australia. She is the one who does all of the illustrations, one of which is up here, which is, if anyone's ever seen kind of like a map of Canberra, this looks very similar to it. And she's the one who kind of really pushes a lot of it and turns a lot of Walter's kind of big ideas into something that is an actual city and design. But despite the fact that it is her illustrations, that it is her research, they decide that it's 1911 and they decide that the Australian federal government likely won't take their competition entry seriously if a woman's name is attached. So they leave it off. And it means that Walter Belly Griffin gets credited as the sole designer of Canberra. The lake gets named after him. He's a name that many Canberrans know. And Marion gets erased from history. And it just really appalled me that, from the very first days of Canberra as a capital city, you have the contributions of a woman being really actively erased and minimized. And that, I was someone who was interested in history, who was a big feminist, and I didn't find this out until I was well into my 20s. And I just thought, and I had this moment, what else don't I know? And the answer was kind of, a lot. And I truly believe that it's through the monuments that we build and the names that we remember that we're sending a loud message about who is worthy of respect in this country and whose contributions are worthy of being respected and recognised. And I think that until you can kind of recognise what women have done to make Australia the country that it is, and in all those small ways as well as the big ways, I don't think that you're going to see gender equity today. I feel really passionately about that. It started with me getting so frustrated that I was like, I need to do something about this. So I started running a weekly walking tour. I had no experience in tourism. I had, as we've all discussed, very little experience in Australian history. I just felt this real need to do something. So I started running a weekly walking tour, thinking that maybe no one would show up. It would maybe be me and one other person. But it was pretty popular from day one. But I kind of thought that it would just remain a side project. I wasn't making any money from it. And I was doing that for 2 years, where it was just a once a week tour and it was a side project. And I ended up kind of leaving my research job. I went and worked at the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House. Then I thought that I was going to go have a career working in museums. And then at the end of 2023, something really amazing happened. I had a publisher reach out. So Hardy Grant Explore is a somewhat large Australian publisher. They fall under Hardy Grant Publishing, and they sent me an email out of the blue, just saying we've seen the tours online, and we think that this would make a great book, which never happens. I feel like that's every author's dream, and it doesn't happen. And I thought that they were trying to scam me, so I didn't respond for 3 months. And then I was clearing out my inbox, and I actually went and Googled Hardy Grant Explore, and I was like, oh my gosh, these guys are legit. And then I responded immediately saying, you know, I'd love to have a chat. Thanks for reaching out. And they got back to me like within a few hours, and we jumped on a call the next day, and they pitched the idea for a book. And they said, you know, like, we really think that there is something here, and we would like to take what you are doing in Canberra and this idea of walking tours to share women's history and just make it national. And without thinking about how much work this would be, I said yes. And a few months later, after the contracts had been signed, I quit my very well-paid job, full-time permanent job at a museum, and I used all of my advance money to buy a 15-year-old Subaru Forester, which is pictured there, and a rooftop tent, and I then spent the next 6 months living out of that. And I spent the next 6 months traveling around Australia, visiting so many big and small towns, looking for stories of women who had shaped history. It was an absolutely incredible trip. It was a 6 months that was filled with so many amazing moments. I was doing it by myself. I don't think there's anyone I like enough to spend 6 months with. And I uncovered hundreds and hundreds of amazing stories of women who had shaped history. I had so many really unexpected and interesting conversations with people I never would have spoken to otherwise, but because they had this kind of purpose, I had a reason to start conversations with strangers. I even ended up going gold prospecting with someone that I met in Bendigo at a free campsite, and it's a wonder that I'm still here, that I wasn't murdered, to be honest. And this book, this year, just completely changed the way that I thought about Australia and what it means to be an Australian. And I think one of the things that still really sticks out to me, especially someone, you know, who was raised in Canberra. I lived in Brisbane for 4 years, but I think I'll always feel like a Canberran at heart, is I think that if you spend the majority of your life in a city, you don't really get a sense of how big Australia is and how just empty a lot of the country is. You know, I could be driving for hours upon hours in the outback and just not run into anyone. You could go on kind of hikes for days by yourself on a more remote area, and again, you wouldn't see anyone. And I think kind of driving those such remote distances for and there being a small town there and learning about how often it was women who held it up really just reshaped how I thought about what it meant to be an Australian and how so much of Australian history is a local history. But that's not how we think about the story of the nation. You know, we think about it through these big defining moments like Federation, you know, like the Gold Rush, like the World Wars. And we think about it often through policy decisions as opposed to what was actually happening on the ground and the people every day who are creating change. So it really reshaped fundamentally how I thought about this country. And I think it gave me a lot more of an appreciation and respect for the role of local history and that tapestry that contributes to what it means to be an Australian and the story of Australia. And it made me realise that this problem that I had been seeing in Canberra of the lack of recognition for women's contributions publicly was not just a Canberra problem, if only, but it was a national one. And I think the other thing that it really made me realise and think about was the fact that Australia, despite being a giant country, you know, in terms of landmass, we are a really, really small country. And I think one of the things that I have taken away from spending so much time reading about women who have shaped history in this country is that it is a small enough country that anyone can shape history here. And I think that this kind of made me go, you know what, this is the thing I'm going to fix. Give me 50 years and we sorted. So I came back, I wrote the book, it's out, you know, it's in stores, it's coming up on a year now. And then I went, I'm going to grow She Shaped History. It's not just going to be a weekly tour that makes me no money. I'm going to turn it into something. And so that year I applied to, and this is 2024, I applied and got into a social enterprise fellowship with the AMP Foundation. Social enterprise, for anyone who's not familiar with that term, is basically any business that is trading and kind of creating revenue for the purpose of solving like a social issue. So we exist because our social issue is that lack of respect and recognition for women's contributions. So we exist to solve that problem. So I got into this program at the end of 2024, and it was $20,000 and 18 weeks of support to kind of like help basically get our shit together in order to scale. And then at the start of 2025, I got into their kind of like next step up, which was $110,000 and 12 months of support. So that was like, and these are the competitive programs, you know, like they gave that to 8 people. So they're really competitive national programs. And I think that it says a lot that they were investing in history. You know, I feel like this is not a space that gets funding very often, especially from like major philanthropists in the social impact space. But they were recognizing that this is a problem that does have the potential to kind of like reshape how we think about Australia. And then I got $400,000 from the Snow Foundation this year, which is a 3-year fellowship and program. So the combined impact of getting all of that kind of like gave me the confidence to go, I'm going to go all in on this. So I went full time at the start of last year, and we just grew really, really quickly as a result of that, and it's still growing. And I knew that if I really wanted to scale up and grow She Shapes History, I needed to leave Canberra. So I did the pros and cons list for Sydney and Melbourne won out in the end because there was a little bit more happening in the commemorative justice space. And I moved here in May last year. I live in St Kilda, so around the corner, and I absolutely love it. I think this is a beautiful city to be in, and I think that it's a city that's really like welcomed us with, you know, like such open and warm arms. So then when I got here, I asked that question of, where are the women in the story of Melbourne? And because I'd done research for the book, I already knew a few of them. But I needed to ask that question again as I was creating the tour for Melbourne. So I wanted to introduce you to our framework for feminist interpretation. And this is kind of like, I wanted to leave you with something actually useful, not just me rambling. So this is how I think about my first one is just noticing and being aware that women are missing. And I'll show you how this looks in practice, and we'll go through some stories together. But I think that if you just go into things with your kind of like women's history goggles on, and you're assuming that women are there, but that they haven't often been recorded, that they might not be documented correctly, that they might be like written about in strange and wonderful ways. So like, it's just kind of noticing that absence that women are there. And then following up with those like good inquiry questions, you know, so like asking questions of, okay, I'm not seeing any women represented in this space, you know, like what were the systems that were maybe making it so that was the case? Oh, if we've got these systems there, why, where else would we find women? So it's kind of like following up with good questions and just asking lots and lots of questions, and then kind of following those leads to uncover the hidden stories, and then telling different stories and telling them well. And then I'm a big believer in kind of like giving women a hero's journey. So kind of, you know, like really reframing how we tell women's stories so that they are not side characters and so that they are central. So I'll show you what that looks like. So has anyone heard of Isabel Clapp? Has anyone been on a tram? So I thought that I would start with something that was iconically Melbourne when I got here, and that was the trams. Melbourne's trams, Melbourne in the 1850s, as all of us here are probably aware, gold rush, place is booming, one of the wealthiest cities in the world. So you have people from across the empire who are descending on Victoria to find their fortune. And then you have the really smart people who are the entrepreneurs who see the business opportunity in those fortune seekers. And one of those couples is Frances and Isabel Platt. I'm looking at my dates, make sure that I get them correct. No, I didn't write down the dates. That speaks to the moment. So Frances and Isabel Platt. And they end up coming to Melbourne, and they set up one of the very first kind of like horse and carriage, kind of like public transport networks to take people from Melbourne to the goldfields. But their big vision and where they really see the opportunity is in a tram system. And so they start lobbying the government. And they spend a few years lobbying the government to build a tram system in Melbourne. And they're successful. And they end up securing a 30-year contract to build and then administer Melbourne's tram system. And in 1883, they secure that in 1881, and then by 1883, the first trams are off and running. Which honestly, I feel that efficiency, we don't see that anymore with government infrastructure projects. And 1883, the first trams are off and running. And so in Melbourne's origin story, you know, of its trams, an iconic institution that is so distinctly, quintessentially Melbourne, you have a woman who is there, whose contributions are heavily under-recognised and undertold. But if you look closely and actually look at everything, you see her there very regularly, all the time. And I think that kind of brings it to like that question of like, why don't we know these stories? Why are women missing from the story of Australia? And I think that it is a good reminder that for so long the people who have written history, actually, you know, the way that I actually really like to think about this, and this is the phrase that lives in my head when I think about history, which is, if the past is what happened, then history is the story that we choose to tell about it. And I think that it's a reminder that history, you know, is like true, and it is a like reflection of the past, but it's a curated reflection. And so often the people who have been curating the story of Australia have wanted to uphold a certain image of what it means to be an Australian. And a really great example of that is, has anyone heard of Billy Blue? Yeah? Great. So Billy Blue is a really interesting figure. So he came over, not first fleet, but one of the first few fleets, and ends up in Sydney. And he had fought in America during the war. He knew the governor of New South Wales, really, like, you know, they bonded over that. And Billy Blue ends up setting up the first kind of ferry system, the first ferry service, yes. The first ferry service in Sydney's harbour. And he becomes a really well-known and notorious figure in the rocks. Billy Blue was an African-American man. And historians in the 20th century, in the 1930s and 40s, noticed how much of a role that he was playing. This was post-White Australia policy being introduced. And they were like, oh, not quite right. And they actively whitewashed him and ignored and didn't write about his race in anything that they wrote about him. So acknowledged that he was a pivotal figure, but did not acknowledge the fact at all that he was an African-American man. Like, that is a clear example of Australian history being constructed to reflect a certain side of a certain vision of what Australia is. And I think it's why when you look at historical documents, you always need to be so skeptical about kind of like who is writing it, what are their motives, and why I think primary sources are so important. And another story that I love and is a fabulous Victorian story that I'm hopeful some people have heard of, because it's one of those other stories that I think reiterates that point and made me start diving deeper into the stories of Australia, is of Fanny Finch.
Yes.
Yeah, I love this story. Who has heard of Fanny Finch besides Jane?
Hotelier or something?
Pardon?
She had the hotels?
Yeah, okay, so a few people, not many, that's great. I think that this is probably one of my favourite stories from Australian history. Fanny Finch was the first known woman to vote in this country. So she voted in 1856. What year did women gain the right to vote at the federal level?
1901.
1902. You were so close. 1902. So women gain the right. So she votes in 1856, so a full half century before. And she is the most unlikely person to have claimed this right. She's a woman of colour, she's African British, she's a single mother of 4, and she's living in Castlemaine, regional Victoria. And Fanny's story kind of in lots of ways begins in an orphanage in London where, you know, she is, it's not one of those, like, it's not a terrible orphanage, she gets a few skills there, and she ends up migrating to Australia as a labourer. And on her journey to Australia, she meets the man who she ends up marrying, Joseph Smith, and they end up settling in South Australia. And it is there that they have 4 children together, and then Joseph keeps getting entangled with the law. He keeps stealing things, keeps committing crimes, he's abusive. And there are multiple instances where the police come knocking and they're like, Joseph, you know, like, we can see the stolen goods in your house, whose is it? And he's like, oh, it's the missus. She just finds things. So she's almost going to jail on multiple instances because of Joseph. So she does something really remarkable, and she packs with her 4 kids and she crosses the border from South Australia to Victoria, and she completely restarts her life. And she ends up starting up a sly grog tent, and then she makes enough money to actually open up a pub. And she opens up a pub in Castlemaine, and this pub ends up becoming incredibly popular. And it also becomes so popular that there is another pub that is run by a prominent businessman who owns a few kind of businesses around town down the street that is losing all of his business to Fanny. So he uses his connections with the police and starts putting in these kind of like tip-offs saying that Fanny is doing illegal things. So she ends up having her pub raided by the police on multiple instances. And each time, you know, it trashes the place, it, you know, like shuts her off for several weeks. And after the final raid, they end up kind of saying to her, like, oh, we thought that you were someone else. And she's like, that is an outrageous thing to say. So she ends up actually writing to the paper, and she writes, you know, and uses her voice, and she says, and these are her words, she goes, I'm a woman with few words and plain spoken, but I've worked hard. And she talks about how she's worked hard, not for herself, but for her kids, and how she deserves better than this, and how she deserves an apology for it not to happen again. And she then kind of like writes again when it happens again, and she calls it out. And then Castlemaine is about to go have its very first local election. And she finds out that that guy who had been working to get her pub shut down again and again was running. And she was like, this is outrageous. This man is not fit for local government or any position in power. So she goes and she looks at the law that had just passed. And it said that if you were a person who paid your rates or bore a miner's license, you could vote. It said nothing about gender. So they just assumed that women would never be in that position where it would be their name on the rates, where they would be running businesses. And so through this loophole in the law, Fanny Finch ends up kind of writing herself into Australian history as the very first woman who ever voted in this country. You know, an African British woman, you know, like a single mother of 4, and a woman living in regional Australia. That is such an important moment in the story of Australian democracy, and that is not a well-known story. And I just think, you know, like, how would that change how we think about what it means to be an Australian if we told more stories like that kind of in schools? Would it lead to people feeling more connected to Australian national identity? I knew that for me, that was definitely the case. And I'm looking at the time up ahead, so I'm just gonna go straight to this one. Is this another story? You recognize it?
Yeah.
I love this story.
I worked with her.
You worked with her. I love this story. I was actually talking with the mayor recently about this, and he really loves the idea of getting her a statue. So Joyce Barry is a remarkable woman. She was the very first woman to become a tram driver in Australia. So despite the fact that you have a woman there at Melbourne's founding moment with its trams, It's not until World War II that women end up being employed to work on the trams. And they're employed to work as conductors or connies. And by the end of the war, you have over 1,000 women who are working as conductors on the trams. But the men come back and those women lose their jobs. And even when they were hired, it was always framed as temporary. You're just subbing in until the men return. Some of the women end up being rehired, and one of them is Joyce Barry. And Joyce Barry was someone who was born in Brunswick in 1922. She, grew up working on her family's dairy farm, and then worked on her brother's dairy farm for a bit, driving tractors, felling trees, doing all the things you do on a farm. And she ends up working as a tram conductress. And then in 1956, she goes, you know what, I can be a tram driver, seriously. So she trains as a tram driver, and in response, the union goes on strike. They call it snap action strike to stop this one woman from getting hired as a tram driver. And they introduce a formal ban on women driving trams. And Joyce continues working as a conductor for the next 19 years. And it is not until 1975 that there's a union meeting happening, and Joyce is there, sitting in this meeting. She's one of the only women, and she's listening to this men debate whether or not they should lift the ban on women being tram drivers. And she ends up just kind of cracking it, and she stands up, and this is a direct quote, and she says, "I don't need a penis to drive a bloody tram." And it kind of exposed the ridiculousness of what they were arguing, because it's true, you do not need a penis to drive a tram. And later that year, Joyce Barry became Australia's very first female tram driver, and she spent the next 7 years working as a tram driver. After 20 years working as a conductress, she had a huge career on the trams. And again, that story is about when you ask that question of where are the women in the story of an institution like trams, and when you look for them, and then when you find them not there, you ask that question of, what is the system holding them back, and where might they be? So I really believe that this framework and just asking good questions and kind of bringing that to your work does make a difference. And if we were all doing more of that, it would shape history. And I really believe that we all have the power to tell different stories about the places where we live, work, and move through. So I will round out now, but I'm going to leave you with that final kind of thought of, if the past is what happened, and then history is the story that we choose to tell about it. And I really believe that we're having this moment at the moment, where we're thinking through, and I work a lot with museums and cultural institutions, where a lot of them are thinking about how do we tell the story of ourselves as Australians and as a nation. And I think it's a really exciting moment to be in the space of history, because we're actively looking at the past and looking for different stories, and looking for different stories about what it means to be an Australian. So thank you so much for having me today. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. I went over, I had really light notes, which meant that I rambled at times. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Oh, Jay?
The idea of reframing history is something that definitely needs to be addressed, and how we teach future generations on what it means to be an Australian. Have you considered approaching a few primary schools through primary schools and saying, do you want to do an excursion with your kids and they can come on a tour or stuff like that?
Yeah, it's the school point is one that I've been thinking about a lot, and that we've been working on a lot for the last few years, and thinking about what is the best way of doing that. So we're currently working with the National Library of Australia on a 3-year project, and part of that is about creating digital learning resources about women's history, so that teachers can easily bring it into the classroom.
Yeah.
Because that was one of the big pieces of the feedback that we got from teachers, was that it is like much easier to find resources for like American women and British women than it is Australian women.
Very true.
But I love whenever kids come on tours and things, but there's no money in it. It's hard to make the business case for, unfortunately. You can't charge as much as for small payments as you can for other ones.
Yeah, so just as a matter of interest, I think it was about a year ago tonight, last year, I attended a lecture similar to yours. It was about statues in Australia. And they said over 85% are just men, but out of the cities that haven't done too bad is Melbourne. So you should be pleased with that.
Oh, I think Melbourne's done.
Yeah.
Melbourne's doing better in
Yeah,
terms of
that's right,
statues, but it's there are, I think it's 560 statues in Melbourne, and only 11 are of real women.
Yeah, what was that? You would have enjoyed them. And just a matter of interest, women coming on the scene, well, we've got Pauline Hanson on the way.
Yeah.
Labour in Queensland.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions or
Isn't
anything?
it true that there's more statues of horses?
Yes. Yeah, I have heard that quite a few times. I've never actually liked that comparison of saying there are more statues of animals than women, because I think it's putting women on the same level as animals, right?
Yeah.
But yeah.
There's more statues of British royalty than there are of women.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Awesome.
I was wondering how you chose which women to include. Like, I did the tour, and it was really obvious going around to the tour. I was just like, I wish you had more time to go to this part. And like, I was wondering how you did trim it down and kind of work out the route and things.
Yeah. Whose tour did you go on?
Zoe's.
Zoe's great. They're all great. I'm just like, who cuts down stories? I'm trying to figure out whose tour.
She put out the story because the tour did overrun in a good way. Like, there's this as well, and this thing was really good.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So to be super honest, when we're deciding on women for the tour, like we're confined to a tour route. So for the Badass Women of Melbourne tour, you know, we knew that tour needed to be in the CBD, that it needed to be like central, that it needed to be under 2.5 kilometres. So then you're kind of, you know, doing a mix of looking for these incredible stories of women and making sure that they're like really intersectional, and you have, you know, like incredible First Nations women, migrant women, you know, like disabled women, queer women, but that they're on a feasible path. Like there were so many women just outside of the route that we had that we would have loved to have included. Like I would love to include Zelda Soprano on that tour. I would love to include the Royal Exhibition Building and the first exhibition of Australian women's work. But I really think, and I was saying this recently, I was in Wollongong over the weekend doing some training with our guides there, that like a really great tour guide is one who exercises strong discipline and kind of, you know, is able to like think about, and with that tour, we really thought about like how do we tell the story of Melbourne from the perspective of women, and what are the key moments that we wanted to highlight, and then how do you bring in women that kind of, you know, support that. So with every single story that we share on any of our tours, it needs two questions. It needs to answer the question of like, how does this woman contribute to our understanding of the story of or the story of Melbourne, and then how did this woman shape history? And then we're also looking at it from that intersectional lens. So it's, yeah, but with a lot of difficulty, a lot of women end up on the cutting room floor. Like, and when I was writing the book, you know, the manuscript, I gave the publisher over 400 women. It's 250 that made it in, and my publisher, Megan, just went through it with a red pen, and she was pretty brutal, and she was like, not interesting enough, you know, like too similar, like, you know, it didn't do anything distinct enough. You got too many publicans. So yeah, but I think that there's too many women who have changed history. It's a tricky one. Do we have any other? Oh, after that.
Can you say She Shapes History becoming an ongoing project where you reach out to the suburbs and look at the women of the 80s and the 90s who shaped the suburbs and Melbourne now, or is it sort of finished at the book?
it's finished or is
Oh, no, we're still running the tours, and we're kind of like,
a growth model?
yeah, we're in a growth position at the moment, so we are scaling up, and that's part of why we got that like social impact funding to be able to grow. So the goal for us, and we're actually working with a few councils on this, on doing that, of developing tours that activate the story. We've got one coming up in September for Boroondara. Actually, we haven't signed the contract on that, so I can't mention that. But the Boroondara one's coming up.
There's people out there in the burbs that no one's heard of that have been really significant in shaping the history of that.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think it's really exciting that we're getting councils reaching out, going, you know, like, we would love to support you to develop a tour to share these stories. Our goal is to expand by the end of next year to 8 cities across Australia, and then we're looking at international expansion.
Yeah, sorry. Part comment, part question, because I find your ethos really interesting, because